Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 600, and I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Once again, this has been an absolutely massive news week, and so I have another show out for you guys today. A lot going on, so a lot to talk about on today's show. In addition to supporting the show in the ways I always ask you guys to, just by sharing it out there and subscribing to the show, today you can find me on Judge Napolitano's show. That's May 23rd, by the way, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I will be on Judging Freedom, so check out that if you have the chance. I think I usually do a pretty good job on the Judge's show and get a lot of information across in just a few minutes. It's a well-produced show, so always have a great time talking to the judge. This show you can find on YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And of course, follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. And all my work is posted either at the Libertarian Institute or antiwar.com. All right, up first on today's show, Estonia says NATO countries shouldn't be afraid of sending troops to Ukraine for training. So the Estonian Prime Minister has downplayed the risks associated with NATO sending troops to Ukraine for training and acknowledging that some NATO soldiers are already there. So the Prime Minister said that if Russia attacked NATO trainers, it wouldn't automatically trigger NATO 5, which outlines the alliance's mutual defense commitments. I can't possibly imagine that if somebody was hurt there, then those who have sent their people will say, it's Article 5, let's bomb Russia. It's not how it works. It's not automatic. These fears are not well founded. And look, she makes kind of a good point that wouldn't necessarily have to invoke Article 5. It's just out of line with today's political reality, particularly in the United States of America, where you could imagine that if any member of NATO, any of our soldiers' trainers would get hurt or killed in Ukraine, Lindsey Graham, and I'm sure Hawks on the Democrat side of the aisle and potentially in the White House, Jake Sullivan, Antony Blinken, may start advocating for this invoke Article 5, or they're going to start putting down red lines. So say Russia wounds a NATO trainer and they say, okay, well, we're not going to do anything this time, but if you kill NATO trainers, then we will. Then when a NATO trainer gets killed, everybody's going to be saying, oh, Biden has to continue through on his red line. And so this red line could trap us into a nuclear war. She said that this is the Estonian Prime Minister, that there are countries who are training soldiers on the ground already, and they are doing so at their own risk. We've certainly known that there are NATO soldiers working with the Ukrainians, at least since March of 2023, when the Discord leads, the very great Jet Teixeira posted those online, and because of that, we have those documents. At least 97 special operators were in the country as of March of 2023. That number seems to have gone up given a conversation recorded by two German military, I think generals, but officers, about British soldiers being on the ground in Ukraine, helping the Ukrainians fire the long-range British Storm Shadow missiles. And so, there's certainly NATO countries on the ground in Ukraine, and while the White House likes to present them all as, oh, they're just there tracking the weapons, doing the typical embassy diplomatic work, it's pretty clear that they are deeply involved in this warfare at this point. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, May 22nd. Speaker Johnson thinks Ukraine should use U.S. weapons on Russian territory. So on Wednesday, House Speaker Mike Johnson expressed support for Ukraine using U.S.-provided weapons on Russian territory, a step that would risk a major response from Russia. Ukraine has been lobbying the U.S. to allow the use of U.S.-provided missile systems on Russian territory in the wake of Russia's Kharkiv offensive, and the idea is gaining support in Congress. A group of bipartisan members of the House sent a letter to President Biden on Monday urging him to lift any restrictions on Ukraine's use of U.S. weapons. The lawmaker said it is essential the Biden administration allow Ukraine's military leaders to conduct full-spectrum operations necessary to respond to Russia's unprovoked attack on sovereign land. Johnson was asked if he supports the idea of Ukraine hitting Russian territory with U.S. weapons and replied the U.S. needs to allow Ukraine to prosecute the war in the way they see fit. Ukraine needs to be able to fight back, and I think us trying to micromanage the effort there is not good U.S. policy. So Moscow recently warned the UK that if Ukraine used British weapons on Russian territory, Russian forces would target UK military sites in Ukraine and beyond. The warning came after the British Foreign Secretary David Cameron said Ukraine had the right to use British arms in attacks on Russia. Ukrainian President Zelensky is asking NATO to take another step that could lead to the catastrophic escalation. In an interview with the New York Times on Tuesday, he pleaded for the Western alliance to shoot down Russian missiles over Ukraine, which would mean direct NATO involvement in the conflict, raising the risk of nuclear war. And we've also talked about on the show how the White House policy definitely seems to be softening on this issue. You will often hear American officials saying that while we don't support, endorse something like that, Ukrainian use of American weapons on Russian territory by Ukrainians, Ukraine can prosecute this war in the way they see fit. And that kind of statement is definitely a flash in yellow, if not a green light. Just, they're unwilling to say that Ukraine has the green light because they had previously said that that was one of the restrictions that they were placing on Ukraine to make sure that this war didn't escalate too far out of hand. And now they're willing to escalate this war out of hand because they're losing it and they don't want to lose it in an election year. So the White House is taking some very dangerous steps, and it's increasingly pushed and backed by Congress in doing so. All right, next up here, Russia begins nuclear weapons drills near Ukrainian border. I wrote this one for the Institute on May 22nd. Russian forces are undergoing a test of their ability to deploy tactical nuclear weapons near the country's border with Ukraine. The Kremlin announced the war games earlier this month in a response to Western leaders suggesting NATO troops could enter Ukraine. According to the Russian news agency TASS, on Tuesday, the first stage of the military exercise on the practice of preparation and the use of tactical nuclear weapons started in Russia. The outlet explains that Russian forces will deploy the Escalate tactical missile systems and the hypersonic Kinzhal missiles with special payloads will be deployed to southern Russia. Belarus is expected to join Russia in the war games. The Russian forces will simulate loading tactical nuclear warheads onto delivery vehicles, but the Kremlin did not say if it planned to test fire any missiles. Now, I'm not, there's no suggestion they would actually carry out a nuclear test, and certainly not an above ground one, but, they would fire one of these missiles on a plane capable of carrying, or from a launcher capable of firing one of these missiles tipped with a nuclear weapon from a launcher. That could be something they do here. So earlier this month, the Kremlin announced the drills, claiming it was a response to a statement from Western leaders about sending troops to Ukraine. Leaders in France and Estonia have suggested deploying their country's soldiers to the Ukraine in recent weeks. Additionally, the UK publicly greenlit a Ukrainian attack on Russian soil using British weapons. The U.S. refuses to explicitly support or condemn the American weapons being used by Ukraine to attack Russia. We just talked about that. Some NATO states have warned the dangers of continuing to escalate support for the proxy war against Russia. The Hungarian foreign minister said some European politicians want to send soldiers to Ukraine, while other European politicians are fantasizing about using nuclear weapons. In any event, this will mean a world war, and those who are in close proximity to the armed conflict will have to pay for this. He added that Budapest has grown weary of the dangerous statements that aims to drag all of Europe and the world into a war with Russia. So, at least some sensibility coming out of Europe. Next up here, this one from the South China Morning Post. China begins military drills around Taiwan. The People's Liberation Army has launched 2-day exercises around Taiwan, 3 days after William Lai was sworn in as the Taiwanese leader. The joint drills include mainland Chinese Army, Navy, and Air Force, and rocket forces, according to the PLA's Eastern Theater Command on Tuesday. The PLA said the exercises will focus on naval and air combat readiness patrols, seizing battlefield control, precision strikes of crucial targets, as well as warship and aircraft patrols near the island to test the joint combat and real combat capabilities of theater forces. Beijing slammed Lai's inaugural speech, accusing him of being more radical in his approach and sending a dangerous signal on Taiwanese independence. And this is something that we did expect from Lai, that he would be, at least a step more towards independence than the previous leader of Taiwan. And that does seem to be playing out. And this does seem to be a response. And, I think the Chinese and the Russian drills probably are trying to send a similar message. And it may not be a coincidence that Putin and Xi recently had discussions in China. Next up here, U.S. working with EU to sanction China. The South China Morning Post reports 2 senior members of the U.S. President Joe Biden's administration discussed on Tuesday cooperation with the European Union on countering Beijing's using additional sanctions to stymie Russia's war against Ukraine and tariffs to deal with Chinese overcapacity. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the administration will work with the European Union to sanction Chinese companies supplying Russia with microelectronics and high-tech products that support Moscow's defense industry. Hours earlier, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said Washington and Brussels will need to stay coordinated to shield the two economies from China's industrial policy. Do you have questions about the biggest topics and trends from... Oh, sorry, that's an ad that I accidentally stuck into this tweet. So Blinken testified at a hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Tuesday, said that the U.S. would continue to sanction Chinese entities identified as providing Russia with products that have military and civilian uses. We've talked about this, this is the dual use claim that everything that China sends Russia could possibly be used as a weapon in the war against Ukraine, when China isn't sending Russia any weapons, and yet the U.S. is dumping weapons into Ukraine as fast as we possibly can. All right, next up here, Blinken says he wants to work with Congress to punish the ICC. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Tuesday said he wanted to work with Congress on legislation to punish the International Criminal Court for seeking an arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Blinken was asked by Senator Jim Risch, a Republican from Idaho, at a Senate Foreign Relations Committee if he would support the legislation to counter the ICC sticking its nose in the business of countries that have independent, legitimate democratic judicial systems. Blinken replied, "Given the events of yesterday, I think we have to take a look at the appropriate steps to take to deal again with what is a profoundly wrong-headed decision. The ICC was previously sanctioned by the U.S. under the Trump administration for its plan to investigate alleged U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. The Biden administration reversed the sanctions, but the U.S. pressure worked to get the court to announce the focus of the Afghanistan investigation would be on Taliban and ISIS-K. The ICC chief prosecutor announced warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant on Monday for their role in the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza, which implicates Blinken and other top U.S. officials for supporting the onslaught. The ICC is also seeking warrants for Hamas leaders for the October 7th attack on southern Israel and the taking of hostages. The State Department said it would rather Israel kill Hamas leaders than have them face trial at The Hague. We absolutely believe that Hamas should be held accountable. That could either be through the prosecution of this war by Israel, it could be by being killed, it could be by being brought to justice in an Israeli court, the State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller said. The Biden administration is opposing the ICC efforts against Israel and Hamas leaders, despite backing its warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin. The U.S. says the ICC doesn't have the jurisdiction to pursue Israeli leaders since Israel is not a member of the court, but neither is Russia or Ukraine. While not having full UN membership, the state of Palestine is a signatory to the Rome Statute, making it a member to the ICC. And look, I think that when you're talking about the ICC here, specifically when it comes to the Israeli leaders, I think there's a very small chance that either Netanyahu or Gallant would ever end up actually imprisoned at The Hague. I think more likely what this is going to do is it's going to build political pressure in America. More Americans will understand what's going on in Israel is profoundly wrong and will demand our government take steps to roll back support for Israel. All right, let's talk about the actual fight. U.S. thinks Israel has only killed 30 to 35% of Hamas fighters. U.S. intelligence indicates that Israel has only killed 30 to 35% of Hamas fighters who are members of the Palestinian group's military wing before October 7th, Politico reported on Tuesday. Biden administration officials also believe Hamas has been able to recruit thousands of new fighters. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that's Charles Q. Brown, warned back in November 2023 that Israel's killing of so many civilians in Gaza would help Hamas recruit. U.S. intelligence that indicates that 65% of Hamas's vast tunnel infrastructure remains intact, another sign of the resiliency of the Palestinian group, even as Israel has decimated most of the strip. It's unclear from the Politico report exactly how many Hamas fighters the U.S. thinks have been killed. The Wall Street Journal reported in January that it estimated Hamas's fighting strength at between 25,000 and 30,000 fighters before October 7th, plus thousands of police officers. U.S. officials have indicated they never thought Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's goal of eradicating Hamas was realistic, yet the Biden administration has strongly backed the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza with military aid and diplomat support. On Monday, Brown and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin both criticized Israel for failing to protect civilians and for allowing Hamas to reconstitute itself, and Israel claims to have cleared. Not only do you have to actually go in and clear out whatever adversary group you're up against, you have to go in and hold territory, then you've got to stabilize it, Brown said. But Israel, I think, is far more interested in removing the Palestinians from the land than actually eradicating Hamas. They see that all as one effort. All right, next up here, Israel's new assault on Rafah is a major setback in the battle against famine. So this is a report from the Washington Post. Israeli military operations this month against Hamas in Gaza, from the last desperate refuge for Palestinians in the southern city of Gaza to the devastated refugee camps in the north, have displaced nearly 1 million people, according to the United Nations, and further sealed off the territory from outside aid. Aid groups say it has deepened the enclave's humanitarian crisis and reversed their recent gains in staving off the starvation crisis and disease. Now, aid workers said they are resorting again to triage instead of looking at antenatal care for pregnant ladies, instead of looking at malnutrition. And now we are looking at how to stop the bleeding. One humanitarian aid worker on the ground said in a phone interview that's continuous day and night. Gaza's latest trials started in early May when Israel issued evacuation orders in parts of Rafah, signaling the start of the long-threatened invasion. And then it's, of course, tanks rolled across the border and took the border crossing. Aid groups say it's every bit the calamity they feared it would be, as fighting has intensified in the east of Rafah, along with the Israeli bombardment and artillery shelling across the city. Hospitals and clinics were shuttered. Warehouses storing thousands of tons of food supplies became unreachable. Border crossings that were in southern Gaza's lifeline were closed and hard to access, keeping food, nutritional supplements, and medicine out, and thousands of critically injured patients penned in. Aid officials have watched in horror and disbelief as nearly half of Gaza's population has been forcibly displaced in just over 2 weeks, with uprooted families struggling to find any open patch of land to settle on. Humanitarian groups have been left with little notion of how and where to serve the starving, the injured, and sick. It was potentially the darkest chapter in this horrendous war that started 7 months ago. Ricardo Perez, a spokesperson for UNICEF, said last week as the disaster unfolded, more than 800,000 people have fled in southern Gaza, according to the United Nations, and at least another 100,000 have been displaced from parts of the north, where Israel also launched a new offensive against Hamas, or at least it claims a new offensive against Hamas. It seems just to, be going through and once again devastating and bombing what is left of the people there. Rafah, the most vital aid crossing on the border with Egypt, is now closed. Thousands of trucks sit idle, some with perishable goods spoiling in the summer heat. The only 2 crossings in Gaza that are nominally open are seen by aid agencies as unusable because of the fighting or because they sat in Israel's evacuation zones. So just absolutely horrible what's happening there. Another story from The Guardian here. Israeli soldiers aiding civilian attacks on aid trucks headed to Gaza. So not only is it hard to get aid into Gaza, but it's just hard to get aid to Gaza. So The Guardian reports individual members of Israel's security forces are tipping off far-right activists and settlers to the location of aid trucks delivering vital supplies to Gaza, enabling the group to block and vandalize the convoys, according to multiple sources. Settlers intercepting the vital humanitarian aid supplies to the strip are receiving information about the location of aid trucks from members of the Israeli police and military. A spokesperson for the main Israeli activist group behind the blockades told The Guardian. So they're openly telling The Guardian that they're getting support from the Israeli military on this. The claim of collusion by members of the security forces is supported by messages from internal chat logs and groups reviewed by The Guardian, as well as accounts from a number of witnesses and human rights activists. So they go through and they document some of the attacks in this article. I think one thing to mention is they seem to be getting far more violent, and now at least 1 or 2 of the truck drivers have actually been attacked as well. And my guess is this is meant to be a form of intimidation, right? They're trying to get drivers to be absolutely unwilling to participate in the process of bringing more aid into Gaza. Next up here, Israel developing long-term military infrastructure in Gaza. So 972 magazine, this is the Tel Aviv-based outlet that's done some good work on Lavender, the gospel, other more nefarious things Israel's been doing throughout this war. Reports more than 7 months into the war, the Israeli military's long-term plans for the Gaza Strip are becoming clearer. From satellite imagery and eyewitness testimonies, it appears the army is destroying homes, bulldozing land, and erecting structures that will enable it to operate in Gaza for years to come. Since the start of the war, the military has demolished buildings along the eastern edge of the Gaza Strip, part of what is widely believed to establish a kilometer-wide buffer zone, believed populated areas in Gaza and Israel, the equivalent of 16% of Gaza's territory, which Palestinians would be banned from entering. Doing so would permanently displace thousands of civilians and severely impact Gaza's already limited agricultural sector. Yet this buffer zone is not the only way the Israeli military may permanently transform Gaza's geography. Since October, the abandoned Nazarene checkpoint, which the Israeli military operated prior to its disengagement from Gaza in 2005, has been expanded into a 6.5-kilometer long road bisecting the strip. Satellite images now show the Nazarene corridor stretching from Gaza's eastern boundary with Israel all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, as well as extensive construction of housing units, communication towers, and other infrastructure. By building outposts along the Nazarene corridor, the army is able to control and restrict movement across the Gaza Strip and continue to carry out ground operations. Such rampant destruction of private property and occupation of territory outside of Israel's recognized borders is a flagrant violation of international law, with immediate consequences for Gaza's civilian population. In addition to the loss of their land and homes, Palestinians who were displaced by the war to go to the south of the Strip are now physically blocked from returning to the north. Now, Israeli officials claim that massively expanding the buffer zone is necessary for Israel's return to towns surrounding the Gaza Strip, which were evacuated after Hamas-led attacks on October 7th, but it also seems to be a strategic move by Israel to strengthen its hand in future negotiations, according to Raham Adwa, a political analyst in Gaza. He explained, on the day after the war, the international community will want to return to negotiations on a two-state solution, and if the PA takes over Gaza, it will have to negotiate with Israel for the military to evacuate the buffer zone. These areas will have the same fate as those taken by Israel in the West Bank. The Palestinians will have to negotiate to get them back. He believes that the buffer zone may extend the entire length of Gaza, including the eastern areas of the city of Rafah, where the military launched its incursion at the beginning of May. And if you think about that, that means that they're talking about destroying at least the eastern half of the city of Rafah and a large swath of Gaza's remaining infrastructure. All right, next up here. Gaza's Christian community dwindles as more than half have fled the Israeli onslaught. So this from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. More than half of Gaza's Christians have fled the enclave since Israel unleashed its onslaught, and the Catholic Church is fearful about their future of the ancient community, Haaretz reported on Wednesday. Before October 7th, about 1,700 Christians were living in Gaza, and that number has shrunk to about 650. Haaretz reports that 450 Catholics are sheltering at the Holy Family Parish in Gaza City. About 150 Orthodox Christians are at the St. Porpyrus Church in Gaza City, and about 40 to 50 Christians are living in the southern city of Khan Yunis. Both the Holy Family Parish and the St. Porpyrus Church have been targeted by Israeli forces. In October, an Israeli airstrike hit the St. Papyrus Church, killing at least 18 civilians, including relatives of the former U.S. House Representative Justin Amash. At the time, about 500 Christian and Muslim Palestinians were sheltering there. In December, the Holy Family Parish came under Israeli siege. 2 Catholic women were killed by Israeli gunfire, and 7 people were wounded. And Pope Francis denounced as terrorism. According to Haaretz, a total of 17 Palestinian Christians have been killed by Israel since October 7th, mostly from the Orthodox community. Cardinals at the Pirba Plaza, the Latin parish of Jerusalem, returned from a 4-day visit to Gaza on Sunday and said nearly all the homes of the Christians in Gaza had been destroyed and that many were sheltering in classrooms at the Holy Family Parish. They've lost everything. Every classroom is housing 1 or 2 families. Speaking with reporters after he visited, Pizzaballa said the scale of the destruction eyewitness is unbelievable, and the poor living conditions, such as the lack of water, electricity, and the absence of security, are dire. He also called for an end to the killing in Gaza. What else can I say? I want to send a clear message to decision makers: enough killing, the war must end, and avenues for various aid must be open to avoid imminent humanitarian crisis. I hope this nightmare ends quickly. In their interview with 60 Minutes that aired Sunday, Pope Francis said he spoke with a priest at the Holy Family Parish, Father Yosef Assad, every day at 7 p.m. I listened, the Pope said the other day. They were happy because they managed to eat some meat. The rest of the time they eat flour. things made of flour. Sometimes they go hungry and tell me things, and the other people there also speak to me at times. There is a lot of suffering. All right. A couple of stories left here to go. Next up is this one. Ireland, Norway, Spain to recognize Palestine as a state, infuriating Israel. So Ireland, Norway, and Spain have announced on Wednesday that they will recognize Palestine as a state, a move that has infuriated Israel and drawn criticisms from the White House. So the Irish Prime Minister Simon Harris said today, Ireland, Norway, and Spain are announcing that we are recognizing the state of Palestine. Each of us will now undertake whatever national steps are necessary to give effect to that decision. The three countries will formally recognize Palestine on May 28th and will join over 140 other UN member states that already do so. In response, Israel recalled its ambassador from the three nations and some of the Irish, Norwegian, and Spanish envoys in Israel for a severe reprimand conversation, according to the Israeli Foreign Minister, Israel Katz. History will remember that Spain, Norway, and Ireland chose to reward Hamas murderers and rapists. The Israeli Finance Minister, Bezalel Smotrich, also responded and said Israel will withhold tax revenue to the Palestinian Authority, which administers part of the Israeli-occupied West Bank. Smotrich is a West Bank settler and favors the expansion of settlements with the ultimate goal of annexing the Palestinian territory. The White House has criticized the move from Ireland, Norway, and Spain, saying a Palestinian state shouldn't be unilaterally recognized. A National Security Council spokesperson said the Biden administration believes a Palestinian state should be realized through direct negotiations between the parties, not through unilateral recognition. Now, the problem with this, of course, is Israel says the one thing they don't want to have happen is to allow for the creation of a Palestinian state. So, you are asking the more powerful party here, the one backed by the U.S., the one that's going to get $20 billion in U.S. arms and weapons this year. You're asking that state, you're acknowledging that that state has to negotiate with a group of people who they absolutely oppress and don't have to negotiate with. You're saying that if they don't enter into negotiations that they don't want to enter into and come to a decision that they don't want to reach, then other countries shouldn't take this action to recognize Palestine. It's just completely stupid and shows how terrible the Biden administration's policy is. All right, wrapping up here today. Very interesting story I found on NBC News. Biden abandoned plan to transfer 11 detainees from Gitmo over political optics. So this is from NBC News. The Biden administration was close to transferring 11 detainees out of the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, to a country in the Middle East in October of 2023, but that was abruptly halted amid concerns about political optics after Hamas's attack on Israel, according to 4 U.S. officials familiar with the planning. More than 7 months later, the administration has not set a new date for the transfer, the officials said, and the detainees remain at Gitmo with no clarity on if or when the transfer will happen. The holdup has frustrated administration officials who say they believe election year politics are supplanting Joe Biden's policy of reducing the population at Guantanamo and ultimately closing the facility. These officials say they are concerned the likelihood that the transfer takes place before November's presidential election diminishes the closer the election gets, and now they worry the stalled process that has left 11 men sitting in detention for months without clarity about when they could be transferred could become a human rights concern. Of course, it's a human rights concern, but again, just an interesting story that, these officials are willing to admit that the Biden administration is making the choices they're making out of concerns for political optics. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. I will come out with another show tomorrow on Friday. I know that's a lot of content for the week. I'm trying to keep the shows a little bit shorter and to really get through everything that's going on as soon as I can. I know there's so much really huge breaking news happening in the world right now. So everybody, thank you all so much for tuning in. A lot of the numbers for the show over the past month have been really good. Of course, anytime there's major news like what happened in October in Gaza, a lot more people will tune into the show to try to figure out what's going on, but that typically dwindles over time. So again, like Russia, the invasion of Ukraine, lots of numbers on the show, then that goes back down, always usually higher than the baseline from before. So we do add new followers during those big moments, and people who continue to stay tuned in and listen over time. But we've had some nice steady growth over the past month too, and I feel like I've been putting out more shows during that time, and particularly the solo shows, trying to keep those to around a half hour. So if you're liking this kind of format with more shows and shorter periods, at least trying to do shorter times, let me know. I really appreciate it, and thank you all so much for tuning in, sharing the show, and everything you do to help expand and grow the audience.